uh, sanitary napkins, which are also largely made of plastic. So we tried to identify where we could, where there were clear HS codes that were relevant to plastics. And we should note that our database does not include what we refer to as hidden plastic trade flows. And this involves the many, many millions of products that are on the market that have plastic embedded in them. So from your iPhone to the television to household furniture to cars, where it's unclear the total share of plastics. But we know that they're in those products. We know that they travel across borders, and that the plastic that's embedded in these products becomes part of the waste stream that countries then face and need to manage. So it doesn't include those, and it also doesn't include all of the plastic that travels across borders that also can't be clearly identified through the HS system. In the HS system, you can identify empty, trade in empty plastic packaging, or sort of, before it's actually been applied to a product, but all of the plastic that's associated with the product, plastic packaging that's associated, so that's in pre-packaged food or in pre-packaged confectionery, drinks, and so on, is not listed as a plastic product per se. And so it's very difficult to track the volume and value of that plastic that's traveling across borders. So on this slide, we simply wanted to say that, underline this idea that the Chapter 39 categories is not enough if we want to track plastic trade. And so we need to look into these other chapters and at this plastic that's embedded or associated with products. And there's still a long way for us to go, and we've been working with a number of researchers around the world and encourage others to join us in this effort to work out how we can better track all of that hidden trade in plastic, because it's surely very relevant to the challenge of tackling plastic pollution. I don't think that I need to look in here, but I would say that just to conclude by saying we think that the database is really good news for transparency. We think it's great that it's an open online resource, and we hope it's very useful to policymakers and stakeholders and researchers alike. We've got a more robust framework now for understanding plastic trade flows, but we also welcome your input on our categorization if you think there's ways in which it should be improved. Just in terms of outstanding work, one of the things that we want to make sure people are aware of is that there are these gaps in the HS classifications that we should be aware of when using trade statistics on plastic. So if you see a line in our database around sort of trade in plastic packaging, you need to be aware that that's only that empty plastic packaging. So it only captures a fraction of the total amount. Looking forward, we do think we should explore amendments to the HS classifications that could support governments and stakeholders to better track plastics trade, and we're doing some work on a study of what kind of amendments could be useful in that respect. And then, as I said before, we're continuing work to understand these hidden plastic trade flows. And then across this, a key thing is to start using this database at the country level, at the sectoral level, to really do some national and regional analyses of trade flows and their impacts on plastic pollution at home and abroad. And hopefully that will really help inform trade policy making. So thank you so much. I'll stop there. And then I shall introduce Diana Barraclough, who's a senior economist at UNTED, and she's going to present to you some of our first findings from the database. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you everybody for joining us. Can you all hear me correctly? Yes? So thank you all very much for joining us, everyone. We are delighted to be with you here today. It's very important, these meetings, and to gather together as these communities to share the work, so we appreciate that. One thing I would just say, Caroline is talking that we have released the database already. We are almost releasing the database. We still some final things that we need to include to be fully complete, but we're really almost there. So let me just give you my screen briefly, and I hope that this screen share will work as everything has worked nicely in the practice. So, sorry about this. So is that correct? Can you all see this nicely?
We can.
Thank you. So you should be looking at, and it's in the full slide. Good. So what I wanted to show was
not quite yet. If you could just click that slideshow button.
Yeah, I did that. Oh, we went up one.
There you go.
So the first database findings that we wanted to show, what is new so far, and some of you who have been following our work will know that we did something already last year at the Geneva Trade Week. We really had some very preliminary findings that we were just excited and we wanted to share these. But now what we have is we can do time series data. So this has been a major piece of work by my colleagues, especially Sonia, who will be speaking shortly. But as a team, we've worked extremely hard, and now we can have time series data that is giving a deeper picture on the trends in plastic. And what you see immediately is really, it's kind of the sister to the slide that Caroline showed before about the expectations of production to just skyrocket. And what we've seen is a big increase in export alongside the production. And in fact, it's a major part of our understanding is that trade is very much related to the increase in production. Trade is an extremely important part of the plastic economy. So what we see in this time series is, as we said, a growing increase in trade in plastic, right up until 2018, when plastic trade was worth more than $1 trillion. And this was our first finding when we first started exploring this database, the $1 trillion worth of global trade in plastic, which is huge. It's 5% of global trade. Very, very important. Now we have more recent data for the last 2 years, and it's indicating that trade is actually going down slightly. In fact, trade in plastic last year fell by more than total trade. Now, of course, last year has been extremely unusual time in all of our lives, and so I think it's too soon to make any kind of judgment about whether this is going to be a consistent fall. And in fact, we need to look also at the volume data to really understand this. And this is what we're currently working on. We're still collecting all that volume data. But what we do see is that the trade in plastic has fallen 7% in the last year. And what we don't know, is this because of the slowdown of trade generally, or is this something more significant? And we simply don't know that yet. We need more information to be able to understand that better. The other thing that is obvious in this chart when you look at it is the growing share in the plastic production from Asia. And this is a very interesting story, because I think this also indicates why the whole plastic story is so complicated and so nuanced and difficult, because plastic has been part of a development path for huge parts of the world, and plastic provides products that are very useful to people and that are valued by people, and that now we see the problematic side of it, but we also for a long time have appreciated the useful side of it, and it's created billions of jobs, and it's lifted communities out of poverty. So we understand already that what we're dealing with is something that's very complex and difficult. Now, if I can take to our next slide. Sorry, this went too fast. As Caroline mentioned to you, one of the important things we wanted to do was to think about plastic in terms of its global life cycle, not just focusing on waste, which is where much of the attention has gone. Waste, of course, is the thing that's most visual, and it's the thing that has galvanized a lot of social efforts to reduce plastic. So it's good that we're focused on it, but now we also need to focus on the whole picture, because what you see is that plastic trade waste is really incredibly small in the entire production of plastic, and yet everything that is made out of plastic will eventually turn up as waste. And yes, we're looking at ways of recycling, and we're looking at ways of managing the waste better, but it's still a very long way to go, and the point is that the production of plastic is immense. The second thing that's interesting in this graph to me, and I hope to you, is that we see all the different phases in the productive cycle of plastic. And the one at the very top, the blue, this is the final manufactured plastic goods. Now, this is obviously a much higher number because it also incorporates the value added that's gone into making final products. But look also at the importance of the orange line. That's the second line there, number one, which is the primary forms of plastic. Now, this is a very, very important part of the life cycle because it's where it all begins. It's with the resin pellets and the raw materials that go into the production of plastic. Then the intermediate and the intermediate manufactured plastic goods are again part of that value chain of making products. And this was really unique and original, that we managed to create all these lines. And I don't want to underestimate for anybody the amount of work that went into it, because we went through individual HS codes, sitting down with scientists and economists and engineers and trying to understand which lines would go into which category. And it's important for the economics of the whole story. Maybe it's not so important from the environmentalist perspective, but if you're trying to think about where the jobs are or where community business, where the business story is, we needed to get this angle. Now, the next slide just shows very briefly what I showed you already, that waste is a very small, it's significant, but it's small compared to the whole story. Now, the primary forms of plastics, which is blue on the left-hand side there, as you see, that was worth $322 billion in 2019. And what we do know is that more than 50% of the entire plastic, of primary forms of plastic that are produced, are actually traded. So you see, trade is absolutely fundamental to this birth of the plastic life cycle. Now, I just want to move on, thinking about why is it so hard to tackle plastic? As I mentioned before, it's a multifaceted and complex. It's very difficult and subtle sector, enormous sector and complex. So in the left-hand side here, we're looking at the volume of exports of plastic, primary plastic, and in the right-hand side, we're looking at the imports. And what we see is that many countries are there both. They're both as importers and as exporters. And this is only the primary. This is only step one of that global value chain. When we go through all the steps, right up to step 5, we see that countries are both importers or exporters, often to varying proportions. But the point that we learned from this is that plastic is absolutely ubiquitous in a daily life of practically every aspect of our economy. And there's no country that's untouched by it. And they're often playing multiple roles. Another question, why is it so difficult to tackle plastic? You see how important it is in total exports for many countries. So we're comparing, on the left half of the graph is 2000, and the right part of the graph is 2020. And we see, so there's some slight rearrangement in the proportions of total plastic from different regions, but the basic picture is the same, that plastic is between 7% or 5%, 3% of total exports for regions. So again, it's significant. Not Africa. Africa is not a significant exporter of plastic, but the other regions are. And so you immediately understand that this is not going to be straightforward to try and regulate or reduce the excessive use of plastic. One thing I just wanted to spotlight on, so in the database, and Sonia will discuss that with you shortly, we looked at some particular subcategories as well that are extremely important from a civil society perspective and economic perspective, and also because we can make alternatives. So here is one looking at plastic packaging. Now, plastic packaging exports is worth around $50 billion last year. And we see that all parts of the world are involved in plastic packaging exports. And this is only the plastic packaging that is visible and measurable. As Carolyn mentioned, there's a lot that we still don't have a sense of how big that is. But on the other hand, packaging is also something that other products can be alternatives to packaging. And now, for example, other parts of the House in UNTED are working with SIDS, Small Island Developing States. Can they make alternatives to plastic for packaging? And many countries are looking at this. Not only SIDS, Finland has a very sophisticated industrial program to try and make alternatives for plastic packaging. And so some countries are finding the knowledge that these categories of plastic exports is worth quite a lot of money, $50 billion, is an incentive to look into the market for alternatives. So maybe that is going to be a new development strategy. Similarly with textiles, for example, synthetic textiles, there's $250 billion a year of exports. Now, again, this has been a very successful development path for many countries, producing clothes, synthetic clothes that are valued, that are traded all over the world, but alternative exist to that as well. And so it'll be interesting to see if some countries find this data useful when they think about their paths. So I just want to finish this by saying, so where is UNTED in all of this? And where does this work that we're doing on the trade database fit in? So the petrochemical and plastics industry does not have one single kind of regulatory framework, unlike, for example, fisheries or agriculture, where there is a clear international governance mechanism and regime. In plastics, it's not like that. There's all sorts of different categories. And UNTED, the trade category, which is that little it's like a honeycomb, isn't it? That's the little cell in the honeycomb on the top right. So we are working in some different parts of this story. We have, as I mentioned, the work on oceans economy by other parts of UNTED. From my branch, the plastic work grew out of our work on Global Green New Deal and the Trade and Development Report in 2019, when we looked at what was involved in terms of finance and industrial policy for making that structural transition to a Green New Deal. And what our analysis is showing is that we cannot just focus on one aspect of this story. In fact, all these different stories need to be considered. And these are not all UNTED, we're just one little part of that puzzle. But we hope that in our work, by collecting data on what is happening in trade and plastic, that will be helpful to the global community in their efforts. So I'm going to stop now and lead on to our next speaker, Sonia. I'm going to go into the chat and I'm going to put a link to a paper that we have on this. So I hope that this will be interesting and useful to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Diana, for the overview. I'm going to turn directly and swiftly to Sonia. Please do, she's going to provide us a quick introduction to the database so that you can see how it works for around 5 minutes, and then we'll turn over to our two discussants. So please, Sonia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Caroline. I'll try to to reply to a lot of questions, because I saw that a lot of people are very interested in all the HS code and how we deal with all that and what is included in which categories and so on. So I won't go into too much detail for now, but of course we are always available. If you have some question, you can either chat or use email to contact us, of course, because we cannot answer to all the questions right now, and I don't have in mind all the HS code included in all categories, I have to say. I will share my screen so you can see here. This is the UNCTAD website, because I don't know if all of you are really used to navigate and to use the UNCTAD website. So I just want to mention that UNCTAD statistics are mainly here, and you can access the UNCTAD stats, which is the most important repository of data within UNCTAD. So the UNCTAD statistics branch is working and is maintaining this database, this data center, we call it. I won't present you UNCTAD stat right now because there are too many things to say, but I will switch to the main purpose of the meeting. So the plastic data sets here, which is not publicly available yet. So we hope we can release it very soon. We have only to finalize a few things before the official and publicly release, but it will be very, very soon. What I want to show is how to navigate and use the database here. For example, I will just open the first table here about the global plastic export and import, the plastic trade. So we are using a specific software to publish the table, which is a multidimensional table. That means that we have a kind of matrix of dimensions that you can rearrange the way you want to prepare the layout and the view you really want to have for the data. For example, if I'm just looking at the product detail, but for one single economy, I can click here to select the economy I would like to see. I don't know, or maybe a group. So the world, for example, I can show the table, and I can easily move the dimension here. And if I want to compare export and import, I can also move, when you have this kind of arrows, 4 arrows, move the dimension to here to compare import and export of total plastics, plastic in primary forms. I can also switch the year if I want another way of showing data. I can switch like this. If I want to remove the product and see only total trade, I can again swap the dimension to here. So it's very easy to just rearrange all the table and have access to the data you really want to analyze or to export. Of course, we have here different kind of export formats. So the first one is CSV file and Excel file. Here it's a more specific beyond 2020 table format, but I think most of you will use the Excel or CSV file format. I would just want to go back to the other tables. For example, here we have separated global plastic trade by country and detailed by HS codes. But here we will have plastic trade by economy, but also with all the partners detail. So if you want to see from where the plastic came, or to which destination Africa is exporting plastic, it's really easy to find that information in this kind of table. I just want to mention also that we have a lot of metadata joined with the table. For example, here you have the metadata joined to the table. This is the table summary, which give you a description of the table and maybe other additional information. You have also metadata joined to the product dimension here. So if I click, I just see that we will have access to full hierarchies, and all the people are asking questions about which HS code have been included and where and in which category. All this answer will be in that hierarchies tables. And maybe one last thing to say is that you can very easily make a first sight on the data just by making some quick chart within the data center, which is not perfect, not always easy to modify. But if you just want to have a quick look on the table, you don't have to export the data and make a chart in Excel and so on. So maybe I will stop here because I think I already spoke too much. So I will stop sharing my screen and give the floor to Caroline. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you again, Sonia. And I must thank you again for being the person who turned our sort of vision and dream here into a reality. So thank you again so much for your work on this, and to our colleagues at UNTED. So I'm going to turn now directly to Shui Hui. Firstly, to give us some impressions that you have as a delegate who's working hard on trade and plastic pollution issues. And then we'll turn directly to Eleanor for your remarks as well. So Shui Hui, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline, for inviting me to join this very important event. We welcome the launch of the new online database on global trade flow across the life cycle of plastics. I also would like to highlight that the database will strongly support the efforts by governments to promote more sustainable trade in plastic and develop policies and regulations on reducing plastic pollution. As Caroline already mentioned, that in November last year, China, together with other co-sponsors, launched an open-ended initiative, IDP, in the WTO, the Informal Dialogue on Plastic Pollution and the Environmental Sustainable Plastic Trade. And so far, we have 18 WTO members have co-sponsored this initiative, and many more members have shown great interest as well. In March of this year, co-sponsors circulated one document named Proposal for a Transparency and International Cooperation exercise. This is something is very close related with the event of today. For the WTO members who are interested in fighting against the plastic pollution, we really think that the transparency and the international cooperation is very crucial. So I think this new online database is something can show that the different international organizations like UNTED and the WTO and many other international organizations can work together to jointly work to fight against the plastic pollution. And also this database, I think, would be a concrete and a constructive step for the WTO members to better understand the nature of plastic trade and the impact of existing trade-related measures to reducing plastic pollution. And also very helpful for us to identify the gaps or limitations in current efforts and explore the scope for more effective approaches. And it will also be very helpful for us to review the trade-related challenges in meeting sustainability goals related to plastics. And taking this opportunity, I would like also to share some little information from China. And China attaches great importance to environmental protection. As you may have noticed, China has announced that its ambitions to peak carbon emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. Recently, Chinese President Xi Jinping also announced at the general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly that China will step up support for other developing countries in developing green and low carbon energy, and will not build new coal-fired power projects abroad. In the context of the WTO, China has actively participated in discussion in different fora, including the Committee on Trade and Environment, the CTE, the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions, TESSD, and the IDP, as Caroline already mentioned. China remains committed to work closely with other members toward a meaningful outcome at MC12 in this regard, especially regarding the IDP, because I am the contact point from China Mission to take care of this IDP. This September, co-sponsors already circulated one draft element for the MC12 outcomes, circulated it to all the WTO members. Now, all of us co-sponsors are drafting the MC12 ministerial statement. We firmly believe that the plastic initiative is a tangible sign of WTO reform in action and can help to provide a bridge between our trade and the environmental objectives. Finally, once again, we welcome this very valuable new online database and highly appreciate the efforts of UNTED and the Graduate Institute. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Wei, and it's really heartening to hear that you find the database useful and a constructive contribution. And also, I mean, I think the key thing is that it's useful to policymakers as you're working out to understand the challenges at hand, and also what kind of policy tools and measures you could apply in this field. So I'm going to turn now to Eleanor, who, as I said, works at the Center for International Environmental Law. They have been extremely active in promoting work around plastic pollution and a global treaty, and also very active around the negotiation and implementation of the plastic waste amendments to the Basel Convention. So Eleanor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you very much for everyone who has been working actually on this database, which is very welcome, as now we are, as we know, insisting so much on looking at the problem of plastic pollution through the life cycle of plastic, and not only from the perspective of the ocean plastic pollution, right? So having a database right now that is trying to look as much as possible, and again, the task is hard because of many points that I'm going to raise regarding plastic, but having a database that is trying as much as possible at giving concrete information about plastic trade and points on plastic and trade in general throughout the life cycle is essential. So as I was mentioning, we have been putting so much attention, as panelists have been saying, about looking at plastic in our oceans, which is something that is particularly visible. But at the center, we have been doing investigations and trying to expose as well the different impacts of plastic through every stage of the plastic life cycle, from oil extraction, petrochemicals, production, the use of plastic and products, waste, recycling, incinerating, and disposal. And you will be wondering, so as we were mentioning through the panel and the conversation today, so where is plastic and trade? And actually, plastic is everywhere on trade, right? So there's trade of raw inputs, subsequent plastic products, packaging, plastic waste, etc. So that's just, again, insisting on some of the points that have been discussed today. But at the center, we ask, so how can this database be useful? And I think it is very important to highlight that it can be useful in 2 points. First, regarding providing more accurate information regarding the magnitude of plastic waste, and I'm going to jump on this very shortly. And the second point is on bringing more information and mapping global trade flows across, again, the entire life cycle of plastic. And it's very timely also on the context of the discussions around the Treaty on Plastic Pollution to have concrete information here. So just coming back again on the question of plastic waste, as some of you may know, there's currently a few legal instruments around this, which is, for example, the Basel Convention or other regional agreements. But these agreements and treaties focus on limiting control on trade of hazardous waste of plastic. So movement between of plastic waste between countries, but is very limited if you look at plastic more holistically and the issue of plastic pollution. One thing that I think it's important to mention from our experience is that it is very difficult, as has been so rightly pointed out by Caroline, to trace plastic waste also in terms of the HS coding system. So currently, how we will look at it will be around HS code system 3915.90, etc., which is level as other plastics. But in reality, what happened, and that we have seen with custom authorities, is that there are so many waste on those specific trays. It's not only plastic; it's mixed of other things, mix of plastic. Many times they're not recorded, so those trades of other plastics occur, but they are not traced, or even they are not sorted out. So this is highly problematic in our opinion. And at the same time, another issue is that maybe we will have, let's say, some information about trade flows of waste of plastic, but what happened also is that we don't get to know where and what we do with those plastic waste. So also bringing more clarity around those points and tracing plastic beyond the fact of looking at only HS code 3915 is particularly important, not only for the full cycle of plastic, but also to get to know more about plastic waste in general. So that's why this is so welcome on this perspective, and also in the terms of the plastic treaty, as Caroline mentioned very rightfully, there are currently conversations and preparing the ground, I would say, on discussing the Treaty on Plastic, which we hope for UNEA 5.2 in 2022, we will have an intergovernment negotiation committee. So it is very timely also to provide accurate information of plastic trade in light of those conversations, to get to know, as it has been again rightfully pointed out, to have a better ground to discuss policy and how to tackle plastic in its full cycle. And with that, I thank you again very much for the invitation and for your hard work on this. And I pass it back to Caroline. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you, for your comments. Very welcome. And Eleanor, I think it's really important that even to highlight that even for those categories of the HS where it appears to be very clear around plastic waste trade, in fact, it's not very clear. and also that it also depends a lot on how countries and exporters and importers use the HS categories and report on them. So there's also an issue of how it's used in practice, and whether or not countries or exporters, what they consider to be, and I guess in the place of plastic waste, what they're trying to hide in terms of their plastic waste exports, by putting them, by miscategorizing them intentionally to enable them to get through. So there's much work to be done also, I think, in the realm of customs controls and so on, and these issues, and help building capacity for countries to monitor and use this system at the border as well. So we've got I think we started just a few minutes late, so we've got a couple of minutes for questions. We have been avidly replying to questions in the Q&A. Could I just check, as I'm speaking with the GTP team, whether we can put people live, or we just use the question and answer box?
It's a webinar, so it will have to be the question and answer box.
Okay,
Caroline.
no problem at all. So I think that we've addressed a lot of the questions in the Q&A or in the box already. One of the key ones I think that came up for those who are not looking at that is when the database will be available, and we've had a response from Sonia that will be before the end of October. And I think here the challenge we're dealing with at the moment is largely one of just checking some of these details, and some of the questions that you have raised today will help us do that, but also to ensure that we have not only the information on value, which you saw in the presentation today, but also the information on volume, which is really critical, of course, from a plastic pollution viewpoint. And one point that I did want to make is when Diana and I present this big table of the value of plastics trade across the life cycle, whilst plastic waste looks, relatively speaking, like a small slither of that in terms of value, of course, in terms of environmental impact, it's huge. So we shouldn't only look at the value level, and that it's not to minimize the importance of the plastic waste trade. It's just to also highlight that there's so much more going on, and that a lot of that other trade, we need to understand the role it plays in generating pollution as well. There was also a question around how it will be updated over time, and maybe Sonia, I could defer to you on that to explain to us a little bit about whether that's an automated process, whether it happens annually, how that works.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll try to update the data once or twice a year, because doing that more often will be difficult, because of course country data are released every day, and we cannot spend our life making just an update for few data. But of course the major updates should be spring and autumn, which correspond more or less to what we do for the current merchandise trade matrix.
Great. Thank you very much. And I should just emphasize again, some of you have been asking questions about what fits in different categories. And when you look at the database online, it will provide a link to all of the HS codes that are in the different categories. So you can look at those carefully. And they're also defined in the HS system. We don't claim to have got all of the categorization perfectly. So if there's someone who feels that we should recategorize as to where these products fit along the value chain, we'd be happy to have that feedback. And one of the questions also is how far up we went the value chain. And so the key is that we went, you would have seen on Sonia's presentation that we have what we call directly sort of trade in plastics per se across the life cycle, but then we also have other trade that's relevant to the life cycle of plastic. So we really went right upstream to feedstocks. So that's things like naphtha trade in the actual sort of fossil fuel feedstocks, and in all the various different chemical additives that can be used in plastic. Just the caution there is it's not that all of that volume of trade is necessarily directed only at plastic, because those chemicals and feedstocks may have other industrial uses. But so, we're cautious about that, but we wanted to put that there to help other people get a bit of a handle on what's otherwise just an immense long list of chemicals and long list of fossil fuel related feedstock. So we've tried to take that a step further, and would really welcome work by others to take that further. But I wanted to turn to Diana if you had any comments on any of the questions.
Yes, the only thing I would just say, we'd love to open the door to it completely to you right this minute, but without the volume, I think it's we only have half the story. And so I think it's very important, especially since we do have this little change that we're seeing in the value. I think it's important that we have the whole picture with the volume too. So please just bear with us a little bit. But I would say on the other side, and maybe this will be very exciting, we also have it in French. So, you know, don't think we're just giving you only half the picture, and maybe we'll get all the languages. That would be a dream too, wouldn't it? All the official languages of the UN, but at the moment it's French and English. So I would just say really thank you so much for your interest and your support. In fact, yes, that's what I would like to say. It's important from our side too to know that the work is useful and relevant for you. And so the comments that we've been receiving and the questions, the feedback from you is absolutely important. And we thank you very much for that and for your support for our work. And also just to say that, you know, we're part of a big community of many people who Anu mentioned at the beginning, all the other researchers in the UN family and in the rest of the development community that we're partnering with. And you know, it's a very, very positive experience. And so thank you, everybody, for that.
Great. Excellent. Well, I think with that, we can draw our discussion to a close for today. I'd really like to thank Eleanor and Schweigre for making the time to join us and provide your comments. We're really grateful that you're a small fraction of the wider population, but if we can be useful and helpful to stakeholders and to governments and researchers all at the same time, that's really our mission fulfilled on our side. And so I really like to thank my colleagues again from UNTED, Sonia, and also Anu for being with us today. And most of all, Diana, who's really been my partner in developing this. And on that final note, I must also note that we've had a colleague, Julian Kristen, who was working with us as a research associate on this. And also my colleague at TESS, Mahesh, who really did a lot of work behind the scenes to try and help us get this database organized in order to hand over to Sonia to do the next step. So thank you all very much. And thank you for joining us today, and to my colleagues at DTP for hosting us as part of Geneva Trade Week. Thank you all.